Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave, always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Thank you, Davine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM in Asheville. And Robin Collier, thank you for managing KCEI in Taos, New Mexico. I really appreciate it. We couldn't do it without you, obviously, because we air on your stations and then follow it with a live on the SoundCloud platform. So that's lots of ways for people to listen to this show. If you would like to reach me, Nave at jamesnave.com. Nave is spelled Nave. I would love to hear from you. And I'll be glad to answer your questions and take any requests you have and any thoughts about where you are, no matter where you are in the world. I'm curious about that location. And I'd like to also remind you that we are sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. The Imaginative Storm Writing Project is a collaborative effort that my creative collaborator, Allegra Houston, and I have been working on for the past 20 years. And in the past 4 years, we've really codified it. We've created some books. We created an online course. We have all kinds of stuff that's going on. Many, many resources for writers. And so if you're in that category and you'd like to improve your writing chops, imaginativestorm.com. That's a good place to look. We would love to have you be part of our community. So today I have a good friend on, Kirk Hardesty. Kirk and I have been friends for many, 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 many years. We've seen each other very often in person. And the reason I'm very excited about this is because Kirk and I are the two anchors that host the Leaf Poetry Slam. It was 2 years, twice a year for many years. After COVID, we've gone back to once a year in October. So between the two of us, we've been on the stage at the Leaf Festival and the Poetry Slam for at least the last 15 years together. I helped launch it 30 years ago. And then when Kirk joined me, I was saved by his abilities as an MC, his abilities as a house manager, most especially his ability to add the scores together. So Kirk Hardesty, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, Navé.
It's a real pleasure to be talking with you. So I would like for you to just start out by giving us a sense of your involvement with the Poetry Slam. I started with my involvement in 1991, 92 here in Asheville at the Green Door. We were just beginning to experiment with all that spoken word stuff. And I know you've been involved in your work in Alabama for many, many years. So tell us about your involvement and what you do and what it means to you, and just fill us in, give us a little history.
Well, I guess I started out probably in 1997, 1998. My wife, Jerri, is a poet, a performing poet, and I have performed and I do write some. She was really excited she found out about Poetry Slam. There was one going on way up in North Alabama and in Florence. And so we drove up there. It was about a 3 or 4 hour drive, and went to the Poetry Slam and met the people who were basically moving and shaking poetry in Birmingham at the time. Lindsay Stone and Hunter Bell and a couple of other people who ended up being on Poetry Slam teams. It just seemed like such a fun thing, being with so many creative people and hearing poetry in such a different way from, the way we'd gotten it academically in school and all. And it just performance brought life to so much more life to poetry. And so we started going. We found out there was one going on in Birmingham. And so we started going to Birmingham. I sort of got inspired and started writing again like I had in college and performing some and had a really good time with it. And then just sort of found myself helping to MC the Poetry Slam in Birmingham. And then there was one going on in Montevallo, a little college town where Jerri and I went to college. The people doing it, they were from a fraternity, and they just decided to quit doing it. They got bored with it and quit doing it. And the venue owner knew that I was helping in Birmingham, and asked me if I would, take over here in Montevallo. And so I did. And that was probably 23, 24 years ago. And we started sending teams to nationals and regionals and meeting just amazing people. Being in college town, we get fresh faces all the time. And so we meet new people, they come through. And of course, COVID took so many things down, including our poetry slam. But we're going to get going again in the fall. We've done a couple in the spring. And so we're going to get going again in the fall. We've got several venue possibilities opening up, showing interest in the poetry slam, getting it going again. So that's what we plan to do. We found out about Leaf. Gosh, our first Leaf was probably 2000, maybe spring of 99. From Joe Spears. He was running the video tent at the time and had his own little poetry thing. Say little poetry thing. I don't mean a little poetry thing in a sense that it's a little thing, but they had the Beat Licks going on. Fun group, very upbeat and positive. And anyway, so we went, and the Leaf Poetry Slam is probably consistently the best, most receptive audience. The whole range of talent and voices and material is just amazing. And when you invited me to help, run the show, it was just, how could I say no? It was a great thing to be a part of. It is a great thing to be a part of.
So we are collaborators in the Leaf Poetry Slam. You and I have been in the slam community many years. I've done a few interviews with people over the years. Not a few. I've actually done quite a few interviews with people who are in the slam poetry community. Slam poetry is big in some circles. Also, there are a lot of people listening to this that have no idea what we're talking about. Right. What is a slam? Do you take a bat and go around and whack the poets on the head and hope they fall over, and then you declare yourself champion? Tell people from your point of view what a slam is, how it works, some of the inside thinking that you have around it, some insights. So what makes it work?
Well, I think originally, at the bottom of it, it's a gimmick. Slam is a gimmick to get people to come out and enjoy poetry and get people to share their poetry. And so we have a scoring system. Score it sort of like an Olympic diving sport. We pick judges out of the audience, hopefully random judges. When I'm looking for judges, I'm looking for people who've never seen Poetry Slam before, so they get to the fresh impression. We basically talk them into doing something which is very difficult, and that is to judge a very subjective art form. Like all art's subjective. I mean, I can't imagine looking at a painting or a sculpture and assigning a number to it. But that's basically what we do with performance poetry. And it has evolved into, such a deep and moving, highly textured sport. I guess it's a sport. You can call it a sport. It's not a physical sport. It's a mental sport and a performative sport. So basically, we try to get the audience involved. We like the audience to cheer and make noise and be happy for good scores and not so happy for bad scores. But we don't want them to be affected by the audience. So it's a really big show, and in its best finest form, it's a big show. But even in the small shows, it's really great. Poets connect with the majority of the audience personally. Leaf is really cool because as big as the audience is, the poets really connect with them, and the audience really connects with the poets. It's an ongoing conversation. You couldn't have one without the other and have, what we call a poetry slam. I know there are online slams going on, and that's okay, but without the audience, it's just not the same. The audience is part of the spirit of the show, part of the spirit of the performance. The poet gets something from the audience as much as the audience gets something from the poet while they're performing on stage.
So your job as the MC and the house manager when you're running your own venues is to make it happen. So tell us what are the rules that you apply in your venue that tighten things up? But what are those rules? Those rules have been established over the years by different experiences that many people have had in the slam. So what do you follow these days, and how does it work for you?
When we started, the National Poetry Slam was already going. And so everybody was basically using those rules as a guideline because the object is to get teamed together and get to the National Poetry Slam. So there's a time limit. There's a 3-minute time limit. We don't want people to, just basically come on stage and camp out, own the place. We want everybody to be able to share their work, their art. So there's a 3-minute time limit, and we start taking a time penalty, which is taking points off the score. We pick 5 judges. We drop the high and the low score. We score from 1 to 10 with the decimal point so that we can break ties. We try to get the judges to not give out too many 30s. That can be hard because, especially with judges who aren't familiar with Poetry Slam, they can be just blown away, by what the poets are doing on stage. We tell them if the whole audience is roaring and you're up and jumping up and down and you're texting everybody you know because your life has been changed. But sometimes you can get several poems in a row that make the judges feel that way, that something just amazing has happened. So, but we have a time limit. We have a scoring system. There are no props or musical accompaniment. You can't use anything to present your poetry that isn't accessible to everybody else in the competition. And of course, you can't bring a guitar on stage. You can sing, you can use paper or a device now. Most poets have their poetry memorized, but sometimes you'll bring something new that you're excited about and you want to share, but you don't quite have it memorized yet. So you want to be sure to get it out there the way it's supposed to be. So you read off a device or a piece of paper or something like that. And I think that's just about it. We have 3 rounds at Bama Slam, Montevallo. Cut the low scores off of each round until we're down to 2 or 3 poets at the end, from the big finale. And the winner gets a prize. Montevallo, we have a $50 prize. We don't give a big prize, but as Leaf, as you know, there's $1,200 donated by the organization, plus whatever we can collect from the audience, which has been sometimes getting close to $1,000, over $700-800 from the audience. People will go out and collect money from the audience during a break. They'll put money in a hat, get that kind of money. That's how much the audiences are affected by the art form.
That's really true. We do pass the hat. It's a bit like church at the Leaf Poetry Slam. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
When we started the Poetry Slam in Asheville in 1992, I had no idea how to do any of it. I'd been performing poetry a great deal in a business called Poetry Alive, and we performed poetry for school kids all over the country. But we were doing the straight up traditional stuff out of the school textbook, like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. And I'd never ever written anything. And so when the Poetry Slam came to Asheville in 1991-92, it came by way of Alan Wolfe, Ginger West, Lee Lancaster, and yours truly sitting here having this conversation with you. I helped with that as well. I just made stuff up on the stage because I wanted to be part of the group. I didn't quite know how to do it. And we were experimenting quite a bit with it back then. One of the things I liked about the experimenting, we didn't have as many rules. It wasn't as confined as it is now in some ways. So when you are working with poets and developing them for the national level work, you mentioned the National Poetry Slam Championships. They finished their run in Denver a few years back, just before COVID. That was the last National Poetry Slam Championship. And then we moved into something you're deeply involved in, which is the Southern Fried Poetry Slam, which is a large network. Now, when you and I are talking about these poets out here running around performing poetry at these larger conferences or larger competitions, we have 80, 90 teams sometime, or 70, or I don't know how many teams showed up at the Nationals. And I don't know about Southern Fried either. So could you give us a little bit of an overview of your sense of what the Nationals were like, and when they faded, how Southern Fried emerged? And Southern Fried came out of Asheville by way of Alan Wolfe. He's the one who invented the idea of Southern Fried. So Asheville has a lot of momentum. Thus, the Leaf Slam, which is 12 miles east of Asheville at the Leaf Festival. So what's your impression of the bigger scale and the national influences that happen around this? And how has that played out?
Well, first of all, to your point, Asheville does kind of seem to be the center of the universe. The Asheville team was at the first Nationals. And as you said, Alan Wolfe and you and I know Danny Solis, Kim Lane were all at the first Southern Fried, which may have been only 2 teams. I think maybe the first Southern Fried. I don't remember. I wasn't there, although some people think I am one of the original guard. We started going at the 6th Southern Fried in Greenville. As far as Nationals goes, it grew into something that was very difficult to manage. I think the largest Nationals tournament we ever had was 72 teams. The organizers came up with different ways, and I was involved in some of the committees to try to work out how to organize it, keep it manageable. Marc Smith himself felt like 32 teams was probably the best size, and that's basically what we've mostly limited ourselves to at Southern Fried. When Nationals went away, it was really kind of a strange thing. It seemed like the Slam Masters shot themselves in the foot and made it very difficult to revive, if not impossible. And then a lot of focus was shifted to Southern Pride because suddenly we were the largest tournament, in the country. And so now we're getting northern teams, Detroit. I think we had one from California this year. It's kind of weird because it's changing our community in a way. I don't think the Slam Masters are invested as much in being a community and maybe shifting more toward the tournament thing. There is community, don't get me wrong. I mean, we hang out on the rooftop of the hotel. We did that this year, with the people that we know, but there's not as much of an effort to get to know everybody, maybe because there are so many people to get to know. I mean, Jerri's always out there meeting people and bringing them in, making them feel welcome. She's a staple of Southern Pride. I think she's an anchor in Southern Pride. The people we know, I love meeting new poets. I love seeing the old poets. And I'm not as deeply involved in the organization as I used to be, but I still volunteer and I help. I'm still, a bout manager and help to keep the show going and everything. But as far as my impression goes, Southern Pride is in a bit of an evolution right now. It's adapting, trying to adapt to the way it's changing. Hopefully not in the same ways that the National Poetry Slam did. I don't think we're trying to grow to accommodate everybody, but we do have kind of a special thing. Southern Pride teams, in-region teams, we have an early registration period for in-region teams. So in that sense, the community is holding together.
When I remember being part of the National Poetry Slam Championships years ago, it was large and it was growing and it was organized in pretty good ways. And there were lots and lots and lots of people, and it moved around from city to city to city to city. And we would have the final night with 2,000 people in the audience, and they're cheering and rah, 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 and having, just having a good old time. And I remember in 1996, Paul Devlin filmed Slam Nation, which is the only documentary film that's been filmed of those early days of the Poetry Slam when it was starting to change, when it was going from grassroots, people just showing up, doing their thing, to more organized, a little slicker kind of operation. And I think it was during that time Poetry Slam Inc. came into focus as well. And so for those people listening, the Slam is a name that comes from baseball. Marc Smith founded the Slam in Chicago in 1984. Long time ago. It was early days. Nobody really knew much about it. They called it the Poetry Slam because it was named after the Grand Slam in baseball. Can you connect emotionally with your poem on stage so thoroughly that the audience responds to you in the same way a World Series audience would respond if you hit the Grand Slam homer, bottom of the ninth, one strike to go, and you knock the ball out of the park, drive 4 runs in, and win the World Series? The place goes wild. Can you do that with a poem? And the answer is occasionally, maybe never, but if you do, you know it. And when you do, the audience knows it as well. And up they rise like the sun coming from the night in taking the night away. They just cheer and off they go. That's what I understand Slam to mean. And that may or may not be true. I don't know, but I love that idea. So I'm going to stick with that story. And at the Leaf Poetry Slam, we really do have that energy all the time. And that's why the Leaf Poetry Slam is an old school experience. So say more to us, Kirk, about the Leaf Poetry Slam and your experience with it and how you engage with it and what it means to you and to the people that you know.
Originally, as you know, we were in a tent outside. The Poetry Slam at Leaf grew so much that they brought us into Eden Hall, where we could fit more people in. It's always been probably the best, most consistent Poetry Slam as far as audience involvement. People keep coming back. There are people who've been coming for 20 years. I know occasionally you're on stage and you ask people who was here 20 years ago, and, someone will raise their hands. People have been coming for 10, 15, 20 years. And sometimes we'll see them in other places. We would see them at the National Poetry Slam and occasionally at Southern Pride. They come and say, hey, we saw you at Leaf. That's always cool. I feel really honored to be a part of Leaf, to be a part of such a creative collaboration, because all the poets come together and do their thing, but everybody's, doing their own thing. We don't really have group pieces at Leaf because it's an individual poetry slam. But the talent and the stories and the connection with the audience, I just feel like when we're sitting on stage watching it happen, I feel like I'm a part of it. I mean, I know we're off on the side and I'm not, performing or anything, but I feel drawn in, and I feel like I'm part of the energy. drinking in the story and the emotion and the meaning. It's a wonderful thing. It's an amazing thing. That's what keeps me coming back. And I think I'll keep coming as long as I can, as long as you'll have me.
So we are on that stage and we're running the slam and we have the people come through and we have 5 rounds and the poets do 3 minutes each and we drop a few along the way and finally end up with 4 poets. You're keeping score and you do a really great job of the scorekeeping and you do it by hand and you apparently have a decent math mind so you can add those figures up pretty quick in your head. I don't know how you do it. I get confused. Give me a sense of what it's like for you to be there taking those scores down and writing them down while I'm calling the scores out. And for people who are interested in how this works, the poet goes on stage, poet performs 3 minutes and does whatever the poet does. Sometimes it's just so astounding, everybody stands up and cheers. And there are 5 judges in the audience placed close enough so we could read their scores, and they jot the scores down on a whiteboard. And then they erase it with a little napkin and they're ready to go again for the next poet. So they write the scores down really fast, 0 to 10 like a diving match, 7.8, 9.1, 8.2, 9.3, and then they just throw them up. And then I call out the scores, and Kirk writes the scores down, drops the high, drops the low, keeps the middle 3. So what's it like from your point of view as you're keeping the scores? And the scores are really important because in the slam, somebody could win by 1 decimal point, and at Leaf, that could mean the $1,000 prize for first place.
Well, it's very important. You have to be really connected to what's going on. And I guess I cheat a little bit. I'm writing the scores down as the judges are putting them up, before you read them out. So I get a little bit of a head start.
I didn't know that. You cheater.
Yeah. I do. And I'm really doing 2 math problems at the same time. I add the numbers on the left side of the decimal first. And a lot of times at Leaf, they're all 9. So it's easy. You got 27. And then I'll add the numbers on the other side, right side of the decimal second in my head. And so if you just, for instance, you've got, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, I know that's 2.1, and I'll just add it together. So you've got 29.1. It's kind of a flow, and I'm in the groove when I'm doing it. And then I can come out and enjoy the poem and then get right back to watching those audience members. And it's just being there in it, seeing as it goes. I like being a part of it.
Well, you just gave me an example, 2.7, 2.8. I was confused right away. I couldn't have done that. I had no idea how to do that.
Well, I've been doing it for a long time now.
I know, but I know it's easy for you, but it seems really amazing to me to be able to do that. I guess people that are listening in the audience who have math minds that can add really fast, they think, well, what's poor Nave talking about? He must be really slow in math. And I am kind of slow on paper math. I'm pretty good. I can tell you how far it is from point A to point B with an estimate, but that's a different kind of math. So talk a little bit more about your sense of how poetry plays out in the culture. And I'm changing the subject a little bit here. We're on the stage and the poets are performing their poetry, and it's the slam style, right? And yet poetry has a much bigger role for us. What are some of the experiences you've had around the role that poetry plays with people and in culture and the way people use it to communicate the essence of who they are?
Well, it's really interesting because a lot of poetry is therapeutic in the slam culture. A lot of people are, I guess, using maybe the audience as a therapist or as an opportunity or a valve to get their experiences out there and relate to them. And it's really cool that so many times audience members will come up to a poet and say, I really felt that. You really spoke to me. You really, helped me see things in a different light. Or, you really helped me see that I'm not the only one dealing with this particular situation, that kind of thing. But as far as poetry slam is really changing poetry in general in a lot of ways. I mean, I don't know if it's having a huge impact, but I know just in the state poetry societies, there used to be kind of a division between page poets and slam poets, stage poets and page poets. And there are so many poets that are doing both. There are so many stage poets that are writing well enough. In the early days, we used to feel like if you could perform well enough, you could perform anything. It didn't necessarily have to be really well-written poetry, but that has changed a lot. The audience expectation is for better and tighter and cleaner, poetry on the page, as well as being well performed on the stage. And so a lot of these slam poets are making inroads in state poetry societies and in state poetry society contests. And I know, for instance, the Alabama State Poetry Society, of which Jerri's been the president right now. She's the vice president of the Alabama State Poetry Society. They were just blown away by the way we would read our poetry, when we would come to the state poetry events. And so many of them, would read on the stage in kind of the academic voice and pacing and all that. And then we would bring our poetry to life. At emotional points, we would be emotional. It really has had, I believe, an effect on the state poetry societies where it's happened. We went to the Texas State Poetry Society recently, last year, to their event, their yearly event, and just talking to the poets about how they were affected by seeing how Jerri, not as much of a performance as she would be at a poetry slam, but just using her voice in a way and her expression and her face and her emotion. We're seeing a lot more crossover. And we've seen the State Poetry Society poets come to poetry slams and say, wow, this is really neat. I never knew you could do this kind of thing with poetry before.
So much of it depends on awareness. I'm thinking now of all of these old photographs taken during the Civil War, the tintypes, when you had to stand very still and solemn and look at the camera. And for many years, people would not smile. Oh, you don't smile when you have your picture taken. And I see photographs that were shot in the 1900s, early 1900s, people just staring stoically at the camera with not an expression on their face. And it's reminding me of some of the poetry readings that still happen to this day. People don't think they can add emotion to their reading. And when I tell people that it's okay to add the emotional atmosphere to your readings, I make sure I tell them that doesn't mean you have to yell, doesn't mean you have to stand on your head, it doesn't mean you have to throw a rock through the window. It just means that you have to allow your emotional interior, the atmosphere, all of those emotional bumps and bounces that are inside of you to just connect with what you're saying and rise up with your voice and see what happens. And it's similar to, it's okay to allow the emotions to smile at the audience, like the old photographs, like the folks finally learned to smile in the photographs. Now everybody beams like the sunshine in the photographs. In the past, I've had poets tell me, I don't perform, I read. And so I've started giving an example of how one can read for an audience and do it perfectly every single time. And the example is I just open the book and I sit there and read. Don't say a word and let people watch me. And they're watching me read my poetry. And anything beyond that is performance, even if you utter one syllable. And it makes a nice point to people. They realize, oh, I'm performing even when I don't think I'm performing.
Yeah, good point. They really are. So you might as well add some flair to it. It's another dimension to poetry, really. It's another way of portraying emotion. And it allows the poet, it's reading on page often, the reader has a relationship to the poem that's divorced from the writer, from the poet. And so when the poet is reading and performing, then they're actually able to show some of what they were feeling when they wrote the poem. And a lot of times, even I will read a poem or perform a poem that I wrote years ago and find myself in that emotion again, that was there when I was writing the poem. And sometimes, to the point of being overwhelmed as I was when I wrote the poem.
Yeah, that is true. I've had that experience as well. And you can do another thing with your voice too. Your voice is a revision tool. As you are writing, you have a certain experience silently because you're there quietly thinking and putting it down on the page. And usually the only sound is the tap, tap, tap of the computer or the sound of the pen on the page or the pencil on the page. Most people probably use pen. Some people probably use pencil. And there's not much action going on sound-wise. So you have an artifact you've created silently. And then when you read it aloud, you are bringing the musicality into it by way of your voice. And you can hear subtleties, or maybe not so much subtleties. You could see overt things that need to happen in the piece that you wouldn't have otherwise seen or heard or known about. And it's all because of that voice engaging as well. So the voice, so you have your imagination, your rational mind, and your voice, all three working in accord.
Another really interesting thing that we have done on the Montevallo Poetry Slam team is to read each other's poetry aloud and see what another, poet, creative person gets out of or brings out of your poetry. We would do that. We would, throw a poem in a hat and take turns drawing out, randomly to see, whose poem you get and read out loud. And you can get something out of that you didn't really know was there when you wrote the piece.
We should do that at Leaf and let people compete with each other's poems. I like that idea.
Oh, cool.
You mentioned briefly, and I think this is worth lifting up, we don't have team pieces on stage at the Leaf Poetry Slam. We do have people who have been on stage and they have been members of Poetry Slam teams that did team pieces. So let's talk a little bit about the team piece so people can get a sense of what that means. What are some of your experiences with team pieces and how do they work?
Well, originally it was a little controversial. Some people didn't like the team pieces. They thought it kind of detracted from the idea of the poetry. When we first started going to Southern Fried, they called them smedleys. And it was a really neat experience, another way to see a poem. And they have evolved over the years. We had some crazy things on stage, from wrestling matches to so many different things people can do. One poet on stage while other poets were off stage doing parts of the poem. We had a woman poet speaking and a male poet off stage actually providing the voice for the poem, which was very strong considering what the piece was about. And they have really evolved over the years. This year at Southern Fried, teams they call them bout fits, they dress up for the bout, and teams, it's almost like team colors. They have coordinated colors, not so much costumes, but coordinated colors, red and white and different colors. Really cool looking, really dressing up. I wonder how much money people spend on their bout fits, for these things. But it really adds an element, a visual element to the performance beyond what the poet's emotion and the acting and the speaking on stage. It's really almost like a play in a way. Poets can put together a 3-minute, one-act play like that. We've also had teams do a series of connected pieces with a theme, a religious theme, a religious political theme, which is always, really cool, telling a story, throughout the bout, because the teams get 4 poems per bout. Usually, originally it was one poet would perform and then another poet would perform and another poet would perform. But then when we started doing group pieces, bringing a lot of group pieces, and some teams do nothing but group pieces. Some of the most competitive teams bring almost all group pieces because they're so rich and full of action and voice and texture.
Yeah, and I would think if you were running all group pieces on a team, and you happen to have one poet you knew could always knock the ball out of the park solo, you would save that one poet to do a solo piece on stage to contrast with the group pieces and give the judges something very different than the group piece, which could drive the score up.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's all kinds of ideas about slam strategy and where you put your strongest piece. Some of the teams front load, so they'll try to get a head start. Send a really strong piece in the first rotation, and then the second rotation is almost kind of a not really dead space, but it's a kind of a quieter. Everybody's kind of on even ground. And the third rotation is an opportunity to get ahead, get a jump again, and the fourth rotation is usually where you put your grand slam piece.
Yeah, and at Leaf, we have usually 5 rounds or rotations, and we have one improvisational round as well. Sometimes we don't do that depending on our time. And it would be interesting to feature a group piece or two at Leaf if we could round up some people that would be willing to do it or could do it. It's a very difficult thing to do. I remember when I did some of those group pieces years ago, I really enjoyed it, and it's quick. You have to know those poems backwards and forwards, and the timing is exquisite when you get it right. And Danny Solis, who left this world last year, I believe, or year before last, time flies. We lost Danny, though. But Danny was one of the masters of the Poetry Slam group piece. And that all came out of the work that we did in Poetry Alive, actually. I don't know if I've ever mentioned that to you or not, but when we were doing Poetry Alive before Alan and I discovered the slam, we were on stage performing poems like The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot, and we were doing them as ensemble pieces. We were throwing the lines back and forth, and we called it, well, we'll just script the poem to make it more interesting for the school kids. So we only had 2 people on stage throwing those lines back and forth, and we would add different voices and things. And then Danny Solis came onto the Poetry Alive crew, and he was touring as well. And he was also scripting poems. And we were scripting poems like The Cremation of Sam McGee or The Highwayman or other classics, The Raven. So we would throw the voices back and forth. Casey at the Bat was another scripted poem as well. So in 1994, when we had the Nationals here in Asheville, we really worked up a whole lot of group pieces and competed with them. And I don't know if there were any other teams competing with them. There were a couple of others. So those group pieces were beginning to emerge in the 90s. And now, as you say things like the male voice off stage matching the woman's voice, that's just incredible at the experimental stuff that goes on. And then the outfits, that's incredible.
And choreography, and sometimes synchronized movements, and then unsynchronized to make a point at the right place in the piece, and just so many things people can do with group pieces, and almost a couple of poets would be kind of making music, or a beat or something, to go with the piece, and just get some phenomenal things on stage. There are really good things to find on YouTube. At the National, I think you can probably search National Poetry Slam and find some really, really awesome videos from the years of the National Poetry Slam that Steve Marsh, I think, is curating and putting those up now.
Oh, that's really something. I'd love to see some of those. I also discovered one thing about song lyrics. This is something people probably don't know. If you publish a song lyric in your poems, if you put a song lyric in your poems, word for word, 3 or 4 lines from a classic hit of yesteryear, and it becomes part of your poem, and you put it in a book, and ASCAP discovers it, they will charge you the full usage rate at the highest rate for that poem, and there's no way you can get out of it.
Wow.
So if it's a song written by, say, Taylor Swift, for example, the most current one now, if you were to put a Taylor Swift lyric into your poem and publish it in a book and not have permission, ASCAP would charge you stadium level fee to have those 3 lines in that book, and you would have to pay it.
Wow.
And a lot of poets don't know that. So that's worth knowing. I want to move toward the end of our time together we have about 15 more minutes or so, talking about the influence that the Poetry Slam has. And I'd like to get some of your thoughts on how sometimes the influence can be really overwhelming. And maybe it wouldn't be even fair to call it an influence. People see the Poetry Slam people up on those stages really rocking the house, really, really great stuff. And they think, I could never do that. It's not in my scope. So I've been on a little bit of a campaign to encourage people to work within their style and to appreciate what the Poetry Slam and the big time performance poets do, and yet try to avoid letting it influence them so much so that they think they don't have anything to say because they can't do what those professional level poets do on the stage. What are some of your thoughts around that? And then you also run open mics in your venues as well, so you don't always have people competing.
Right. And there's always been kind of a tug of war, I guess, between poets wanting to do their own style and wanting to score well on stage. And so sometimes there's been talk about Poetry Slam formulaic Poetry Slam, poems written on stage. Taylor Molly had a great one, How to Write a Political Poetry Slam piece, and that's probably up on YouTube right now. Really funny. And that was kind of a jab at formulaic poetry, like repeating something 3 times and things like that. I've always thought the best thing about Poetry Slam was all the different styles, all the different ways that people approach it, the different things that people have to say, the way they shine a light within themselves usually looking at things outside of themselves and the way they look at things outside of themselves. A really cool thing that we did for a long time at the Poetry Slam events was what we called poetry tag. And one night, I think this happened in Americus, Georgia in 2000, we were just hanging out at the hotel around the pool, and Jerri saw a poet kind of quiet and said, "Hey, I haven't heard any of your poetry, this year at Southern Pride. Would you like to do one?" And he did. And so then she just kind of started picking other poets. And the next year we did it again, but then we let the poet who did the poem choose somebody they hadn't heard from before. And we started calling it a poetry tag. And so we'd get people up in our room, and sometimes the room would be packed. It became kind of a big thing, almost overwhelming. Speaking of overwhelming, so many people in the room that you almost couldn't get anybody else in there. And the cool thing about poetry tag was that people got to do the pieces that they didn't feel were real competitive pieces. Mm-hmm. And so you could use that skill, the voice, the inflection, the intonement, intonation and everything on a piece that you didn't really, or your team didn't want you to do on stage. And so I think that's really cool. I do worry sometimes that poetry slam would become a little too defined, maybe, and not as creative because people are trying so hard for the points, rather than, as Alan Wolf says, the points, are not the point. The point is the poetry.
That's right. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, the points are not the point. The point is poetry. The points are not the point. The point is poetry, or something like that. Yeah, that's true. Well, it's really important to me to encourage people to get to know their voices. And it's important for each one of us to make a nice relationship with our voices, regardless of what comes out of our mouths, to learn how to appreciate the voice, and also to understand your voice is such a beautiful byproduct of the instrument of your vocal cords, of you. So to honor the voice when it comes out is really worthwhile. And then to take that beyond, and then go beyond the honoring to say, I could apply this to a reed. I don't have to be so categorized into one tight box. So I'm trying to get people to understand that if they speak their voice, they speak out, they allow whatever their urgencies are to come forth. Sometimes it could be in painting and photographs, spoken word on the page. Let that come out in whatever form it comes out. And when you do that, other people notice it, and it just makes the world a little bit better, I think.
I think I've thought many times that the Poetry Slam community, the group of creative writers and performers, could have a really large positive impact on society, given the right exposure. You see politicians speaking on stage before, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and not really saying anything new or saying anything that's going to have a positive impact on society that's just going to get them elected or get them, back into their job or into a new job or whatever. It's basically just a job interview. But I've always thought, and I've said to some people, that I think the right slam performers with the right heart and the right spirit could really have a huge positive impact, on our society. We've all fragmented with the internet. The internet is such a cool thing, in that you have access to the world at your fingertips, literally access to the world and everybody in the world at your fingertips. But we're all, sometimes focused on really small things rather than actually trying to communicate and network in a way that makes us see each other, as people, not just images on a screen. I'm a dreamer. I want to see the world change for the better, and I'm afraid that it's not. And I think slam poets, so many of them, like Ed Mabry, is so influential. He has such an impact on a crowd. Help people see the world as a better place, and help people see everybody in the world as people just like themselves, instead of, as we are now, just one side or the other.
Yeah, and I'm thinking this idea of the world as a better place, it's almost too broad. I want to make my experience in the world a better experience. Means something more to me than me making the world a better place. I'm making my experience in the world a better, more meaningful, wholesome experience for me. Maybe that will ripple to somebody else, and they will feel better about themselves, because better implies to me, oh, I'm ill and now I'm going to be better. I'm over my sickness. I'm better now. And so I know what it means to feel better. And I know what people are trying to say about making the world a better place, but I wonder if we could think of another way to say it so that it has more impact on what motivates us to do the good work in the world. I want my life to have meaning and significance. And if my life does, then your life will too, if we encounter each other. And if you and I are doing that individually and we come together, we will add meaning to both our lives. And then thus it ripples out.
You make ripples pond of humanity no matter what you do. And you're right, making the world a better place is so broad in general. It's really overwhelming thing, but we can have positive impacts on people around us. And I like the way Poetry Slam so often does that for people. You see people walk out of a show beaming, feeling like they've experienced something that makes them see the world a little bit differently.
And I think now that I'm rolling this around in my head, we may not be able to make the world a better place, but you and I can make the Leaf Poetry Slam a better poetry slam by bringing all of the experience we have to the table. Your MC experience, my MC experience. We do try to make it a better show each time. Bring the quality to it. Bring the excellence to it. Striving for something that has pop and joy and can be exquisite. And so we can make something better. And maybe that's what we mean when we say we want to make the world a better place. I want to make this radio show a better radio show each time I have a conversation with somebody like you. And that intention to make the radio show better just ripples out. And maybe that is what betters the world.
Yeah, I think so. As a host for Poetry Slam or Open Mic, we're sort of the interface between the artists and the audience. We kind of make it happen. We direct the traffic and give them a way to, relate to each other. And that, I think, makes that experience better.
Yeah. And if somebody falls off the stage, we pick them up. And we've had people fall off the stage before at Leaf and many, many other little quirky things that go on. And that's another thing I like about the Leaf Poetry Slam. It's so fun and odd things do happen on the stage that are really, really unexpected and nothing really ever bad, except that one fellow from Georgia. I don't remember what his name was, but he did his poem and he backed off the stage and tripped over the monitor and almost hit his head on some rocks at the fireplace, almost hit his head on some fireplace rocks. So that was kind of a problem, but he got up, came back out, had his arm bandaged, but he still did a poem anyway. So Kirk, to give us a little bit of a sense of, as we close, how we can connect with you down in Alabama and become more involved in whatever you're doing down there, if anybody's passing through town, and what do we do to connect with you?
Well, you can find us. We've got a Montevallo Poetry Slam page on Facebook. That's probably the best way to reach out to us. Jerri and I both keep an eye on that. I'm not as active on Facebook as some people are, but I do check it occasionally. And as we do move into the new slam season, that's where we'll be, putting our information up for the public. So you can reach me there.
Well, Kirk Hardesty, thank you so much for being on Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Nave. It's been fun.
And that, my friends, was Kirk Hardesty talking with me about the Leaf Poetry Slam and the Poetry Slam in general. The next Leaf Poetry Slam will be coming up at the Leaf Festival, October 17th through 20th on Saturday night, October the 19th at Lake Eden Hall. We'll have 500 people in the audience, big stage, lots of sound. Kirk and I will be on stage managing the event as we've done for the past 15 years. So if you can attend the Leaf Festival and join us for the Poetry Slam on Saturday night, it will be great to have you there. Theleaf.org is the website where you will find all that information. So when Kirk and I were talking, we mentioned the judges and the scores 0 to 10 like a diving match for the Poetry Slam poets. The highest score you can get is 30, and one of the most prized accomplishments in the Poetry Slam is getting a perfect 30. The perfect 30, which means all 5 judges give you a 10, and it adds up to 30 even when you drop the high and you drop the low. You drop 2 10s and you keep 3 10s, and it equals 30. That's a perfect 30. Does it ever happen? Once in a while, it does. Has it ever happened at the Leaf Poetry Slam? Yes, it has. Sonia Renee Taylor got a perfect 30 at the Leaf Poetry Slam and won the entire evening. It was an amazing experience. So I'll set the scene for you. The Leaf Poetry Slam has 12 poets in the beginning, We go for one round. At the end of the first round, we drop 6 poets and keep 6 poets to go on to the second round. For the second round, the poets regroup because they know they're competing for the top 4 slots to go into the third round. So at the end of the second round, the 4 poets that have the top scores go on, and we say goodbye to 2. Throughout this whole time, the poets know that they have to keep their poetry performances under 3 minutes and 20 seconds. They have 3 minutes for the poem and then a 20-second grace period, and if the poets go over 3 minutes and 20 seconds, they get a half point off for every 10 seconds they go over. This is critical. The third round is an improvisational round. It works very easy. I stand on the stage and I say, give me an improv topic. I do instruct the audience to make the improv topic not so obvious, something that might be a bit challenging for the poets. Doesn't always happen that way, but often you get something interesting. There's no time limit on the improv. The 4 poets come up. I give them the topic, which they already have because they've heard it called out from the audience. They step up to the mic and they make something happen. It's very, very cool to watch this unfold. The poets sometimes are very original, sometimes they're clumsy, sometimes they're not quite sure, and then they catch the wave. Anything can happen during the improv round. It also serves as a way to balance the room out and to sorbet the evening with a little bit more fun. And of course, the night Sonia Renee Taylor was competing, she was in the improv round and did very, very well. So after the improv round, which is the third round, we move to the fourth round, which is a straight-up 4-poet competition with poems that they have memorized and ready to perform. So you have 4 poets in the improv round, 4 poets in the fourth round, which is a straight-up round. So after the improv round and the fourth round, we drop 1 poet and keep 3 for the fifth round. We move into the fifth round. It's a straight-up round. All the poets compete with each other, the 3 poets, to see who gets the highest score, and we drop 1 poet in that round. Sonia Renee Taylor, of course, made it through all the rounds, and she competed in the 5th round, and she was still in the game for the 6th round. We dropped 1 poet and kept 2, and Sonia Renee Taylor was one of the 2, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember the name of the other poet who made it to the final 6th round with Sonia Renee Taylor. But it did happen, and here's what happened. In the Poetry Slam, strategy is a big deal. So the way we conducted the last round and the way we always conduct the last round until we arrive at the last round is cumulative scores. So everything the poets do throughout all of the rounds follow them all the way to the final round. At the final round, we eliminate the cumulative scores, the 2 poets go head-to-head, and whoever has the highest score wins the prize, which is $1,000. I determine who goes first by shuffling the 2 cards that I have in my hand with the poets' names and all their scores on the cards, and whichever comes up first is the poet who goes first. Usually it's better to go second when you're in that final round because you know what you have to deal with, and you know what you have to beat, and you know how much to push it or hold back or what to do. So the second slot in the final round is always essential. That night, Sonia Renee Taylor's name came up first. So she had to go first. She didn't have the more prized second slot in that final round. Sonia Renee Taylor was a seasoned performance poet, a champion. She had won many national championships, so she could hold up under the pressure. She knew what to do. She knew how to do it. So when I introduced Sonia Renee Taylor for the last round, she stepped on stage and slowly walked to the microphone. She took her time. In the Poetry Slam, the time does not start until you speak the first syllable. You can take as much time as you want walking up to the mic, which Sonia Renee Taylor did. She was first. She knew she had to really do well. So Kirk Hardesty and I were sitting on the sideline watching her do this. She started out slowly, like she'd walked up to the mic slowly. It was a long time ago, and I cannot really remember exactly what the theme of her poem was, but I do remember distinctly the theme of the energy and the artistic approach she brought to this performance. Like I said, she started very slowly. Kirk and I were watching, and we knew she had the chops to take this somewhere, and we couldn't wait to see what she would do with it. So it was a very interesting build. As I said, she started slowly and started to build her piece, and you could chart it almost mathematically. About 30 seconds into it, she started lifting the energy up. She started pushing it a little bit more, picking up the pace, slowing it down, picking it up, slowing it down. And then she got through the first minute into the second minute. So in the third minute, she knew she had 1 minute to go plus a few seconds, grace period. And what she did during that third minute was what made it art. She waited until about 30 seconds before the poem concluded, and she picked up the pace. She amped up the energy, and you could feel the audience cheering already. And then about 15 seconds before she concluded it, she took it up 20% more. It was like watching a rocket take off for the moon. She gave a pitch-perfect performance, and the audience roared to compliment the rocket takeoff that she was giving them. It was an amazing sight. And after she finished, she took a breath, bowed her head, and slowly walked back off. By this time, the audience was up, big standing ovation, and they were stamping their feet on the floor, so the wooden floor was rattling and the audience was yelling, and the scores were up and the audience was cheering, and I looked out over the scores and I saw a perfect opportunity to even amplify it more. So I said, I don't know what she has. Let's see what Sonia Renee Taylor's score is. Does she have enough to win this? Let's see. Judge number 1, 10. 10. Judge number 3, 10, 10. And judge number 5, a perfect score, 10. She has 5 10s. Drop the high, drop the low. And Sonia Renee gets a perfect 30. And she surely did. Kirk knew it. I knew it. The whole audience knew it. The reason I don't remember the poet's name who came after, that was something that was impossible to compete with. That poet had to get a perfect score. That poet had to do what Sonia Renee did, and it was an impossible task. The poet did well, got maybe 3 10s, a 9.7 and a 9.8, but it was a 29.9. Sonia Renee won the slam with a perfect 30. And she took home the $1,000 prize. And to this day, I have never seen anything quite like it. Even so, we've had plenty of great poetry slams and lots of high scores. And I can tell you many, many more Leaf Poetry Slam tales if you'd like to hear them. Unfortunately, we've arrived at the top of our hour. So I'm going to have to say goodbye to you now and just tell you once again, thank you so much for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to. And remembering, I'm your host, James Nave. Always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Devine Dial, thank you for managing WPVMFM in Asheville. And Robin Collier, thank you for managing KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio in Taos. You can always reach me, Nave at jamesnave.com. I would love to hear from you. And a reminder, we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. You want to improve your writing chops? ImaginativeStorm.com is a good place to do a little research and find out how to do that. ImaginativeStorm.com. And so there you go. Thank you so much for being with me, spending this time. And hey, I hope you come back soon. And until then, maybe I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.